Snow drifted down like a tired blessing over the quiet, wind-swept town, settling on rooftops and railings as though the night wished to soften the world's sharp edges. Lanterns flickered against the cold, their glow trembling each time the wind curled around the empty street. It was Christmas Eve, though no hymn, no laughter, no warm chorus rose to greet it, only the low groan of the boarding house sign as it rocked back and forth in the storm. Inside that narrow wooden building, in a room no bigger than a pantry, Mei Lin Zhao sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening to the night that did not know her name. Her breath rose in tight, white clouds, the air cold enough to sting her teeth. She wore the same travel-worn dress she'd crossed oceans in, a simple blue cotton faded to the color of old prayer flags. Her hair, pinned neatly this morning, hung loose now from hours of tremors she would never admit were from hunger. A single lantern burned on the crooked table beside her, its flame low, throwing long shadows along the slanted walls. Every time she blinked, the darkness chased closer, as if hoping to claim her entirely. She did not cry. She had run out of tears somewhere between San Francisco and this weather-beaten frontier town where her name was mispronounced, where her eyes drew stares, where children paused mid-snowball to whisper. The mail order papers lay folded before her, edges softened from being held too tightly. She had been promised a husband willing to take in a quiet, hard-working bride, a man named Caleb Harlan whose letters spoke sparsely, almost awkwardly, of needing someone to help him keep a home too empty after loss. He had not promised affection. She had not expected it. But she had expected someone to meet her at the station. Someone to say her name. Someone to claim the contract stamped and sealed in red ink. Instead, Mrs. Whitcomb had been the one to greet her, if a stiff nod and a turned shoulder could be called greeting. The boarding-house matron had surveyed Mei Lin with pursed lips, her eyes sharp as sewing needles, and announced to the other women in the hall that the foreign girl had been left waiting all afternoon. Perhaps, she had added, loud enough for the whole entryway to hear, the rancher took one look at the photograph and decided she wasn't what he wanted. Mei Lin had bowed her head, not because the words hurt, they did, but because she understood the language of dismissal in any tongue. She had followed Mrs. Whitcomb to the small room upstairs, accepted the key, and waited with her coat still on for hours, expecting at any moment the sound of boots on the steps, a knock, an apology. But the knock never came, and eventually the cold seeped through the coat, through her bones, through the thin barrier she placed between hope and heartbreak. Downstairs, the boarding-house dining room clattered with cutlery, laughter, and the bright noise of a feast she was not invited to join. Roast meat, bread, sweetened apples. She could smell everything through the door, scents so rich they made her dizzy. Mrs. Whitcomb had said, "You can eat when your husband pays for your keep. Until then, I cannot extend charity." The words had stung more than the hunger. Charity, in Mei Lin's mind, was not something she needed. She had arrived prepared to work, to earn her place. But tonight, she had no place. Not here. Not anywhere. A thin ache twisted beneath her ribs. She pressed her palm to her stomach, willing it to quiet, to hide its shame. She had eaten nothing since dawn. The boarding-house floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she shifted, the sound loud enough to make her flinch. The loneliness in this room felt like a living creature, breathing beside her, watching her every small movement as though to remind her she was foreign even to the walls. The church bells in the center of town began to ring then, slow, solemn chimes marking the evening services. The sounds drifted across the snow, muffled but persistent, slipping through the cracks in the window frame. Mei Lin recognized nothing of the words the bells implied, nothing of the traditions that surrounded her, yet the sound made her chest tighten. Bells, in her childhood, had meant celebration. Here, they sounded like reminders. Everyone had somewhere to belong tonight, except her. She drew the thin blanket from the foot of the bed, pulled it around her shoulders, and lowered herself onto the narrow mattress. The straw inside rustled softly. She lay on her side, facing the wall, tracing with her eyes the faint lines where the boards met. She imagined the rancher, Caleb Harlan, out there somewhere in the storm, perhaps delayed, perhaps unaware she had arrived. But imagination was a dangerous comfort, and she stopped herself before hope could grow teeth. The lantern flickered. Its flame shrank lower, fighting the cold. Mei Lin exhaled slowly, practicing the quiet calm her mother once taught her on nights when fear prowled close. "The world shifts," her mother had said. "Be the stillness that remains." But stillness did not warm her. Stillness did not fill the hollow ache beneath her ribs. Stillness did not change the truth. She was alone on a night meant for gathering. Her eyes closed. The sounds of the town softened, the bells fading, the laughter below dying down, even the wind quieting to a soft, rhythmic breath against the window. For a moment, she felt herself drifting, not quite asleep, not entirely awake, suspended in that fragile place where the mind loosens its grip on the present. She did not hear the front door open below. She did not hear the burst of wind that followed. She did not hear the heavy boots stamping snow from their soles. All of that was swallowed by her exhaustion. But she did hear, just barely, the faint, distant murmur of a voice. A man's voice. Low. Rough from wind and travel. Speaking to someone downstairs. The sound drifted up the staircase like smoke. She could not make out the words. She only knew they were meant for another woman or for no one at all. Certainly not for her. Yet the moment that voice emerged, something inside her stilled. Her breath caught, held, as though recognizing a shift in the world she had long stopped expecting. She opened her eyes, staring into the dim lantern light. And though she could not know it yet, that single voice downstairs was the beginning of everything. Snow clung to Caleb Harlan's coat like a second skin as he stepped into the dimly lit boarding house, breath steaming in the cold air that followed him inside. The warmth of the hearth hardly reached the entryway, yet it was enough to make the storm's roar fall behind him, muffled like a scolded animal. He paused by the door, removing his hat with a slow, deliberate motion, snow sliding from the brim to the floorboards. His shoulders sagged under the weight of the ride, but deeper still under the knowledge that he'd arrived far too late. Christmas Eve. Of all nights to fail a promise. Mrs. Whitcomb bustled forward with an expression that tried to be polite but cracked at the edges with something sharper. "Mr. Harlan." "You've finally come," she said, emphasizing the last word as if she had rehearsed it for hours. Her gaze swept over his coat, then toward the stairs. "Your bride has been waiting." She spoke the word bride as though it were an inconvenience she'd rather sweep out with the chimney soot. Caleb did not answer right away. He took a slow breath, warming cracked hands near the hearth before lowering them again. He was a man of few words, and even fewer excuses. "Where is she?" he asked quietly, and though his voice carried no urgency, the steadiness in it made Mrs. Whitcomb stiffen. "She's upstairs," she replied. "Sleeping, perhaps. Hungry, I imagine." The implication hung in the air, sharp as a blade. "She didn't join the Christmas supper. I couldn't very well feed her without payment, could I?" Her tone wavered between justification and pride. Caleb's jaw moved once, a subtle tightening. He did not raise his voice or accuse her. He simply nodded, though the gesture carried more disappointment than anything spoken aloud. His boots echoed softly on the wooden steps as he ascended, the lantern light below flickering across the walls like hesitant hands reaching for him. Each step tightened the knot already winding inside his chest. He'd told himself she would understand. Storms rolled in quick across the plains, and ranch work never bent neatly to a man's schedule. But the guilt was a stubborn thing. He had asked a stranger to cross oceans for him, and he had failed to meet her at the rails. He imagined her alone, misunderstood, shivering under a thin blanket in a room too small for hope. He knew something about loneliness, perhaps too much, and the thought of having caused more of it pulled at him like a weight. The hallway upstairs was narrow, quiet except for the faint rasp of wind crawling under the eaves. He stopped at the door Mrs. Whitcomb had indicated. A faint glow leaked from the crack beneath it, her lantern, dying but refusing to surrender. He lifted his knuckles but hesitated. He had planned no speech, no apology, no tender words. Words had never been his strength. Work, steadiness, silence, those were languages he knew. But an apology deserved more than silence. Before he could knock, a whisper of movement inside caught his attention. Not footsteps, breathing. Slow, tired breathing. He lowered his hand. To wake her now, after the day she'd endured, felt selfish. Instead, he rested his palm lightly against the door, as though the wood carried some part of her exhaustion. "I'm here," he murmured under his breath, not meant for her ears, but for his own reckoning. Downstairs, Voices rose again. Laughter, clinking glasses, a holiday joy that felt out of place against the thin barrier separating her loneliness from their celebration. Caleb's gaze drifted toward the stairwell, and he descended once more, boots heavy with the decision forming inside him. Elias Crowley, the storekeeper, stood near the hearth warming his hands, a cup of cider in his grip. When he spotted Caleb, he offered a thin smile. "Heard your bride arrived earlier," he said casually. "Quiet little thing. Don't think she understood half of what folks said." His voice dropped into something that pretended to be concern. "Some folks wondered if you changed your mind." Caleb looked at him, not with anger, but with a silence so firm it made Elias shift his weight. "I gave my word," Caleb said. "A storm doesn't change that." Elias cleared his throat, then laughed awkwardly. "Well, sure. Just saying. Folks talk, you know how it is." Caleb did know. He knew gossip had the speed of wind and the cruelty of winter. And he knew Maylin had surely heard enough of it to wound her dignity before he ever stepped through the door. He returned to the hearth, holding out his hands to absorb what heat he could. He imagined her upstairs, curled under the thin blanket, lantern flickering low. He imagined how her hunger must feel, sharp, cold, humiliating. It wasn't right. It wasn't how he wanted their first hours to unfold. A sudden urge pushed him toward the kitchen doorway. He found Mrs. Whitcomb washing dishes with sharp clattering motions. "I need food prepared for her," he said quietly. "Something warm." Mrs. Whitcomb didn't turn. "Kitchen's closed. I'll pay." He set coins on the counter, not tossed, not slammed, simply placed with finality. Only then did she look at him. Something in his expression, its steadiness, its unwillingness to bend, made her lift the pot from the stove and ladle stew into a bowl without another word. He carried the tray upstairs, each step deliberate, balancing the bowl so it wouldn't spill. When he reached her door, he paused again. He could hear her breathing still, soft, steady, unaware. He hated to wake her, but a deeper voice inside him whispered she deserved warmth more than rest. He knocked gently. No answer. He knocked again, softer. Still nothing. He eased the door open an inch, enough for a sliver of lantern light to escape into the hallway. She lay on the narrow bed, blanket pulled high, hair spilling across the pillow like ink on snow. Her face, though pale from cold and hunger, carried a quiet grace that tightened something deep in his chest. He could not wake her. Not like this. Not from exhaustion he'd helped cause. He set the tray gently on the table beside her dying lantern flame and stepped back, closing the door without sound. As he reached the bottom of the staircase, the front door blew open again, wind roaring in, lanterns flickering wildly. Mrs. Whitcomb rushed to secure the latch, muttering about storms and ill omens. But Caleb stopped mid-step. Boot prints, fresh ones, tracked across the floor toward the boarding house. Someone else had arrived in the storm tonight, and they were coming inside. The door slammed against the wind once more before Mrs. Whitcomb managed to shove the bolt into place, her breath sharp with irritation. The storm screamed outside like some wild creature desperate to claw its way in. Caleb stood in the entryway, staring at the fresh boot prints leading from the threshold toward the staircase, prints he knew weren't his. Snow still melted in small silver pools around them. Whoever had entered had come in hard and fast, and the weight of their stride felt wrong for Christmas Eve. Mrs. Whitcomb brushed past him. "Probably some drifter trying to get warm," she muttered. "This weather brings all sorts." But the tension in her voice betrayed her attempt at casualness. Something about the storm, or perhaps something about the boarding house itself, had stirred a wariness neither of them wished to name. Caleb said nothing. He listened. Wind moaned. Floorboards creaked. Far off, a shutter slapped against a window frame. But upstairs, nothing. Silence so complete it set his teeth on edge. He moved toward the staircase, boots heavy but controlled, every step placed like a man approaching a tethered horse that might startle. He didn't want to wake Maylin, but he also refused to leave her undefended, not after all she had endured already. Halfway up the stairs, a faint rustle reached him. Not movement. Paper. A whisper of something being brushed aside. Instinct tightened his muscles. He took the next steps faster, gripping the railing as the lantern at the hall's end flickered low, casting shadows that wavered like breath. He reached her door. It was slightly ajar. He had closed it fully when he left. The air shifted around him, cold creeping through the crack as though someone still lingered nearby. He pushed the door open, slow enough not to startle, quick enough to confront whatever waited. But there was no intruder. Only Mei Lin, sitting upright now, the blanket pooled around her waist as she blinked at him with dazed eyes. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, framing a face sharpened by hunger and faint surprise. She looked fragile in the dim lantern glow, but not broken, more like a candle that had burned too long without tending. Her gaze moved to the bowl on the table. She blinked again, the smallest frown forming, as though unsure whether it had truly been left for her. "This?" Her voice trembled before she could steady it. "This is for me?" Caleb took a step inside, careful not to crowd her. "Yes." She stared at the bowl as though it were something dangerous or magical. Her fingers touched the edge, recoiling slightly at the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, though her tone carried layers she could not yet voice. Gratitude mixed with confusion, fear, wariness, and something softer that frightened her most of all. He nodded once. He wanted to say more, wanted to explain his lateness, the storm, the delay no apology could erase, but explanations felt hollow beside her exhaustion. So he stood, letting silence speak without demanding anything from her. She lifted the spoon, hesitated, then took a slow, careful sip. He watched her throat work, watched her eyes close briefly as warmth seeped into her body. The second bite came quicker. The third quicker still. He turned slightly away, giving her privacy in a moment that carried the weight of a confession. Hunger was a shame imposed, not earned, and he would not stare at her like a spectacle. While she ate, the lantern hissed faintly, flame shrinking but stubborn. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders relaxed. It felt, strangely, like witnessing someone step back into themselves after drifting too far from shore. When the bowl was half empty, she paused. "I didn't hear you knock," she said softly. "I didn't want to wake you." Her eyes lowered. "I thought I was forgotten." The words, so quiet they almost dissolved into the air, struck him harder than any accusation. He shifted his weight, searching for something solid to offer. "You weren't," he said simply. "The storm slowed me, not my intent." She watched him a long moment. Her gaze was not sharp or accusing, merely honest. And honesty, when held by someone who had been wounded, held far more weight than suspicion. He cleared his throat gently. "There were footprints downstairs," he added. "Someone came in after me." It wasn't a threat, only a statement of fact, but she stiffened, clutching the blanket tighter. "I checked the hall," he continued, voice low, steady. "No one's here. You're safe." Something in her posture eased, though not entirely. She had lived too many months relying on herself to surrender fear so quickly. "I'm sorry," she murmured, looking down at her hands. "I should not be a burden." "You aren't." He said it with such quiet conviction that she lifted her head, caught off guard. No praise, no pity, just certainty, spoken like a truth he had carried long before tonight. And though she didn't answer, something in her softened, the smallest shift, like a window cracked open to let in new air. Wind rattled the shutters behind her. A gust pressed against the walls. The lantern flickered dangerously low. "You should rest," Caleb said. "The storm's worsening. I'll be nearby if you need anything." He stepped back from the doorway, preparing to leave her to sleep. But before he crossed the threshold, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Harlan?" It was the first time she'd spoken his name, and the sound of it, gentle, unsure, held something unexpectedly intimate. He turned. Her eyes held his just long enough to reveal a question she was not yet brave enough to ask. A question about tomorrow. About what she was to him. About whether she had crossed an ocean only to remain unclaimed by the life she'd been promised. But she didn't voice it. She only said, "Thank you for not looking away." He bowed his head slightly, an acknowledgement deeper than words. Then he stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly between them. As he reached the stairwell, the lantern at the end of the hall sputtered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the corridor into darkness. And downstairs, the front door latch shifted, as though someone, some unseen presence, had just slipped inside again. Morning came reluctantly, dragging a pale, milky light through the slanted windows of the boarding house, as though even the sun feared disturbing the fragile quiet lingering in the halls. The storm had not ceased. Instead, it had settled into a thick, muffled world of white where every sound arrived softened, hesitant. Caleb stood near the entryway, fastening the last buckle of his coat, the leather stiff with the memory of yesterday's ride. He wanted to take Maylin away before the town fully woke, before the gossip sharpened its teeth, before Mrs. Whitcomb's sighs and stares could carve deeper shadows into the woman who'd slept hungry under this roof. But Maylin descended the stairs with a poise that startled him. She moved slowly, hand grazing the rail, her hair braided neatly down her back. Her dress remained worn, her cheeks still pale, yet something in her gaze had changed. She looked as though the night had granted her not rest, but resolve. "Good morning," she whispered, voice soft enough that the wind nearly swallowed it. Caleb nodded. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words tangled. He'd meant to tell her she could stay another day, that she didn't owe him bravery right now. But before he could shape a single sentence, Mrs. Whitcomb materialized from the kitchen, arms folded tight. "Out early, Mr. Harlan?" the matron asked, eyes flicking over Maylin with a hint of poorly concealed skepticism. "Taking her to the ranch so soon? The roads aren't fit. Storm's still blowing." "I'll manage," Caleb replied, tying his gloves. "We won't stay in town longer than needed." Mrs. Whitcomb sniffed, unimpressed. "Well, I hope she's prepared. Folks'll be looking." Her gaze dropped to Maylin's hands. "And you might want to remind her not to keep her head down so much. People take that as fear." Maylin lowered her eyes instinctively, then caught herself and lifted them again, chin trembling but lifted all the same. Caleb felt something fierce and protective tighten inside him. Without meaning to, he stepped closer to her, not touching, but close enough that the gesture formed a quiet shield around her. "She's fine as she is," he said. Mrs. Whitcomb raised a brow, but said no more. Caleb guided Maylin toward the door, pausing only long enough to help her into the heavier shawl he'd brought from the ranch. As he draped it around her shoulders, she inhaled subtly, taking in the faint scent of wood smoke and horses that clung to the fabric. Scents familiar to him, foreign to her, yet comforting in their own way. Outside, the wind pressed against them, scattering snowflakes in wild spirals. Caleb led her down the steps, his boots crunching through the icy crust while her lighter steps left delicate impressions beside his. The street was quiet except for a few early risers clearing paths with shovels, their breath rising like white ghosts. The first whisper came before they reached the general store. "That's the bride. Poor thing looks half frozen. He sure didn't pick her for beauty." The words slithered through the air, carried by voices that pretended not to care whether she heard them. Maylin stiffened, fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. She did not look down this time. She kept her gaze forward, but her breath quickened as though each whisper pushed against her ribs. Caleb slowed his stride to match hers, watching her carefully. "You don't have to listen to them," he murmured. "I am trying," she said, though her voice wavered. They passed the smithy next, where a man hammered iron with rhythmic force. He paused mid-swing to glance at them, wiping his brow with the back of his arm. "So that's her," he said loudly. "Didn't expect her to be so small." Another voice chimed in from behind a frosted window. "Hope she can work. Man needs a strong woman on a ranch." Maylin's shoulders folded inward as if trying to hide from the cold and from them. Caleb's hands curled into fists inside his gloves. He wanted to silence every voice, every stare, every careless judgment, but he swallowed the impulse. She didn't need a battle. She needed steady ground. They continued walking until they reached the center of town, where the church bell hung silent beneath its roof of snow. People gathered here even in storms, trading greetings, clearing their porches, beginning their day. And as Caleb and Maylin stepped into view, conversations dipped. Heads turned. A silence born of curiosity and prejudice rolled outward like a slow tide. Maylin froze. Caleb felt it the moment she stopped. Her breath hitched, her hands trembled, and for a heartbeat she seemed as though she might turn and run back into the boarding house, back to the dim room where silence was painful but familiar. "I can't," she whispered. "They're all looking." Caleb turned to her fully, lowering his voice to something warm as a hearth. "You don't owe them anything." Her eyes glimmered with unshed fear. "But I don't belong here." "That's not their decision," he said gently. "And not mine alone." The wind lifted the edge of her shawl then, wrapping it around her like a cloak. Something flickered across her expression. Not courage exactly, but the faint echo of it, enough to straighten her back by a fraction. She inhaled slowly, exhaling a trembling breath that frosted the air. "May I walk beside you?" she asked quietly, surprising him. "You already are." The shift was small, almost imperceptible, but it rippled through her posture. She stepped forward again, and though the whispers still rose behind them, she no longer shrank. She walked with a fragile dignity that seemed to grow with each hesitant step. They were nearly past the church steps when a sharper voice sliced through the air. "Hey, Harlan!" Elias Crowley stood with arms crossed, snow gathering on his coat. "You sure that's the wife you wanted? Doesn't look like she'll last a winter." Maylin faltered. Caleb stopped. The silence between them stretched, taut and cold. Caleb turned slowly toward Elias, his expression calm but unyielding. "I didn't choose her for you to understand," he said. "And she'll last longer than most men you know." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the gathered townsfolk. Elias blinked, taken aback. Maylin's breath quivered, but when she looked up at Caleb, there was something new behind her gaze, something like gratitude, or perhaps the earliest flicker of trust. Caleb offered her his arm, not insistently, not dramatically, but as a quiet invitation. For the first time since arriving in this country, Maylin accepted help without shame. They walked on, leaving judgment behind them. But just as they reached the edge of town, a figure stepped from behind the livery stable, someone neither of them expected, blocking their path with a purpose written plainly across his face. And he spoke Maylin's name as if he had come to claim what was never his. The man stepped forward with the certainty of someone who believed the world still owed him something. His coat was travel-worn, his boots caked with layered mud, and his breath smoked through the cold air like a warning. But it was his eyes, dark, narrow, searching, that struck Maylin first. Recognition washed over her face, not with warmth, but with dread. She froze beside Caleb, the fragile courage she'd gathered trembling again in her chest. "Maylin," the man said, voice low, clipped by winter wind. "You left before I arrived." Caleb shifted, subtle but protective. "Who are you?" The man looked at him as though Caleb were a snowdrift blocking the road, an inconvenience to step around. "Her escort," he replied. "I was paid to bring her belongings from the rail station." He paused, letting the words hang like bait. "But I arrived to find she'd vanished. Didn't expect to chase her across town." Maylin swallowed hard, hands curling into the shawl. "I didn't vanish," she whispered. "I waited. No one came." The man gave a thin, dismissive laugh. "I was delayed. Hardly my fault. But you shouldn't be wandering alone." His gaze snapped to Caleb. "And you, if you're Harlan, you made things mighty inconvenient." Caleb's brow lowered. "If you have her belongings, hand them over. She doesn't owe you more than that." The wind howled around them, scattering snowflakes into spinning, frantic spirals. The townsfolk, sensing tension, edged closer, some pretending to clear paths, others simply watching with the sharp interest of those hungry for a morning spectacle. The man's jaw clenched. "She signed a contract," he said. "I'm responsible for delivering her properly. And she doesn't leave with a stranger until—" Caleb stepped forward then, not aggressive, not loud, but with a presence that changed the air. "She's not leaving with you." Maylin flinched, but not from Caleb's tone. From the memory behind the man's words. He had been the one who ushered her from train to lodging in the previous town, pushing her along with impatience, grumbling that foreign brides complicated everything. She remembered how he snapped when she asked questions, how he treated her like cargo, not a person. She remembered how the moment she arrived in this town, he disappeared without a word. "He is not my guardian," she said softly, almost to herself. "He never was." The man's stare sharpened. "You keep talking like that, girl, and you'll find yourself nowhere." Something in Caleb's restraint cracked, quietly, internally, but unmistakably. He stepped closer, placing himself fully between her and the man. "She's not girl. She has a name. And she leaves with me." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Elias Crowley whispered something to the smith, who folded his arms and watched with a wary curiosity. The man bristled. "You don't get to claim her until she's properly delivered." "And you don't get to raise your voice at her," Caleb countered. It was the calm in Caleb's voice that rattled the man most. Rage fed on noise, but Caleb offered none. Only a steady, unshakable line drawn in the snow between what she'd endured and what she would endure no longer. The man's hand twitched toward his coat. Not a weapon, Caleb saw that quickly, but a paper, the contract, crumpled in his pocket. He yanked it out, holding it like proof of ownership. "She signed this. That means—" "It means," Caleb interrupted, "you finish your job and go. Nothing more." For the first time, the escort hesitated. Caleb's stance, the growing crowd, the shifting wind, it all unsettled him. But pride was a heavy burden, and he slammed the contract against his palm. "She leaves with whoever paid for her. And I don't hand her over without confirmation that—" Mei Lin stepped forward. Her voice was steady now, though soft enough to require the whole street to lean in. "I am not an object to hand over," she said. "If Mr. Harlan will take me, I will go with him." It was the first time she had chosen openly. The words hung in the air like a lantern suddenly lit. Caleb felt them settle inside him, gentle and fierce all at once. The man stared at her, incredulous. "After all all you did," she said quietly, "was bring me to a door and leave me there. You did not stay. You did not help. You did not care whether I was safe or hungry or alone." Her words struck with the precision of someone who'd survived too many silences. The man's frustration deepened. "You don't understand how these things work." "I understand enough," she replied. "I understand that I am done being spoken for." A hush fell over the town square. Snow drifted like slow-falling ash. Even Elias Crowley had stopped smirking. Caleb stepped closer to her, not touching but near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "We're leaving," he said, voice gentler now. The escort's shoulders slumped, defeated not by force, but by the uncontestable truth that he'd lost control the moment she found her voice. He tossed the contract into the snow. "Fine. Take her," he muttered, turning away. "Not worth the trouble." He disappeared into the veil of white, swallowed by the storm. Silence lingered. Mei Lin exhaled a breath she'd been holding for months. Caleb watched her, seeing something new in her posture, something unbroken at last. He extended his arm to her again, slower this time, as though offering a choice she had every right to refuse. She placed her hand there. Together they walked to the horse-drawn wagon waiting near the livery. Caleb helped her climb inside, tucking the blankets around her as the wind cut sharper. She watched him tighten the reins, his movements patient, practiced, steady. When he sat beside her, she turned slightly his way. "You came back for me," she said. He looked at her with quiet honesty. "I should have been there from the start." She shook her head. "You're here now." He lifted the reins. The horse began its slow journey up the snow-covered road, away from the town that had judged her, toward a home she'd never imagined she might earn. As they crested the first hill, the storm thinned just enough for the ranch valley to appear below, golden lamplight glowing faintly through the windows, smoke curling upward like a promise. Mei Lin's breath caught. Caleb glanced at her. "Welcome home." And though neither spoke again, the warmth between them grew with each mile, filling the small wagon with the certainty that something sacred had begun. Behind them, unseen in the white distance, the escort paused once to look back, because somewhere in that snow-covered town lay a truth he had never expected. She was no longer afraid. She belonged to no one's silence now.